Welcome to the wintry February program of the Dr. Harold C. Deutsch World War II History Roundtable. Again, I really do appreciate all of you that did brave your way out this evening. It shows your dedication. Theo Stavrou, from the University of Minnesota. He was born in Cyprus, received his degree, PhD, from Indiana in 1961. His concentration was in modern Russian, Balkan history, and has been at the University of Minnesota since 1961. He's published several books and is an editor of a publication on Greek history from the university. And I think the other thing that's very notable is he was a colleague of Harold Deutsch. Harold hired him at the university in 1961. I know that they were great friends, and many of Harold's books were sent to the University of Cyprus, which Theo was part of the founding. He is one of the board of regents of the University of Cyprus. So travels extensively, has been to Russia, speaks the language, and I'm happy for many reasons. One is to reach to a dear friend of Harold's, to have him speak to us. The other is to find someone that can speak so knowledgeably of an area that has been important over history and is important to us in contemporary, because if you remember, we still have American troops in there trying to solve a problem that Hitler tried to solve in the 40s and many other people have tried to solve through the years. Would you please welcome Dr. Theo Stavrou from the University of Minnesota. Theo?
I'm delighted to be here with you this evening. But I am not only delighted, I am honored, because I have the opportunity to say a few words at a gathering which honors Harold C. Deutsch, who was, in my estimation, really Mr. History in the state of Minnesota, and national and internationally recognized, a person whom I admire for his erudition, but also for his humanity. It was a matter of great privilege for me and my wife that a few years before Harold died, he and his wife Elizabeth passed through Greece, and we had a wonderful summer together, a few days in the summer together. But what really fascinated me that summer was that when I was trying to show Harold around in Athens, I was trying to do what I always do with guests. I would just speak in generalities because most people don't really like details. But Harold was very much interested in details. And then I remember that really one of the first courses he taught when he came to the University of Minnesota was a course in ancient Greek history. Those were the days when people really were encyclopedists. They were polymaths. And as a matter of fact, really, very few of you probably know that Harold C. Deutsch's first book dealt not with the Second World War, but in fact, it dealt with the origins of Napoleonic imperialism. I was thinking really, how could I possibly pay tribute to Harold's erudition? Especially since I'm really going to talk about a topic that I always admired him, saluted him, I was in awe of him and everything. And then it sort of occurred to me that maybe one of the ways by which you can do that is by making some kind of a reference to the first and very important book of his, The Origins of Napoleonic Imperialism. I will come to that in just a minute. But I want to say that I'm really delighted also because I ran into a few friends here already who inevitably asked the question that everybody asks me nowadays: have you retired? Are you still working at the university? Yes, I'm still working at the university, and I hope that I will be able to work a few more years. It's been a wonderful place to work. It's been a good career. I've enjoyed it. I still enjoy it, and as long as health permits, and as long as I enjoy it, I intend to stay there for some time. Now, my friends, I realize that this is your field. In other words, all of you in some way or other have been coming here and hearing and telling stories about the wars, about the way human beings deal with each other, not in their living rooms, but on the battlefield. Now, I am not really a military historian. As a matter of fact, Mr. Patton told me that he does not want me to give a run-of-the-mill military history of the subject. And how indeed can that be? How, in other words, can I speak about the war in the Balkans, and I'm talking about the Second World War, and trying to give a military account of the same? I am really very much interested in the origins of wars. I'm very much interested in the process of war, and more important than that, really, I'm very much interested in the impact of wars. But what I really have decided to do with you this evening is really try to deal with an aspect of the Second World War which is oftentimes ignored. And one of the reasons which is ignored is because, for all practical purposes, we did not really have what you might call really an invading force in that part of Europe during the Second World War. There were attempts, and there were aids sent of one form or another. But we did not really have an invasion of the Balkans, as it were. And oftentimes, really, we wonder why we did not have an invasion of the Balkans. Churchill, as you may remember, wanted very much to do something like that. But the Americans, they really insisted that that did not have the priority that Churchill thought it should have. So what I have decided to do this evening, really, I'm going to talk about the two countries which in some respects really were affected profoundly, not only during the war, but since the war. A few words about Yugoslavia and about Greece. Because both Yugoslavia and Greece were, along with Albania, which of course had entered into the fray a little bit earlier, but especially Yugoslavia and Greece, were the occupied countries of the Balkans. The other Balkan countries, including Romania and Bulgaria, they are going to be countries which are going to enter the war, in many respects, really as satellite countries of Hitler, or as allies of Hitler. So in many respects, really, Romania and Bulgaria did not feel the full impact of the Second World War. Of course, they were humiliated, and of course, they lost territories and what have you. But in many respects, really, they had their own governments. Oh yes, they were subservient to the Germans. But on the whole, really, they were able to go pretty much with their business, whereas in the case of Yugoslavia and of Greece, not only they were invaded, but their entire infrastructure is going to be destroyed. And the loss, really, of the civilian population is going to be immense. It is also very important to think and speak a little bit about Yugoslavia and Greece, because in the final analysis, events in Yugoslavia and Greece affected the outcome of the Second World War in another theater, namely further in Eastern Europe toward Russia, connected, in other words, with the invasion of the Soviet Union by Hitler in June of 1941. But I am also very much interested in these two countries because in the final analysis, Yugoslavia is going to emerge as a federation, as a republic, which is going to last for something like 40 years before it will succumb to the chaos which we know it today. A friend of mine by the name of John Lampy, a Minneapolis person, wrote a very interesting book called Twice There Was a Country. That's the history of Yugoslavia. Twice there was a country, he said. It's a fascinating book, and I recommend it to you. He speaks, in other words, about the Yugoslavia that was set up after the First World War, which lasted from 1918 to 1941. That was the Yugoslavia which in many respects was an anachronism. It shouldn't have come into existence. After the First World War, after all, there was so much emphasis on national identity or independence of nations and what have you. And if really one was going to follow a good many of the statements even of President Wilson, then it seems to me that what should have happened in 1918, after the Paris Peace Conference and what have you, we should have had a number of little states set up in the Balkans, all of which would have their own ethnic identity and geographic kind of territory. Instead, however, we are going to see the imposition of a settlement on that part of the world, which is going to be Yugoslavia, all the southern Slavs put together, which is going to stretch all the way really from Slovenia in the north and go all the way down to Macedonia in the south. This Yugoslavia, the first Yugoslavia, is going to last for 20 years and it's going to come to an end in 1941. The second Yugoslavia is going to be imposed again, this time on the Serbs or on Serbia and the southern Slavs by a fellow who was not a Serb, a Croatian by the name of Joseph Tito. Now Tito, in other words, is going to be from Croatia and who is going to emerge as the most important of the resistance of partisan leaders during the Second World War. Well, this country, the second Yugoslavia, is going to last for approximately 40 years. In other words, twice as long as the first one. What is really fascinating, however, about the second Yugoslavia is that, despite the strange way by which it was brought about, a lot of people felt that even after Tito died in 1980, that it was going to continue. There was a great deal of optimism in the West, that Yugoslavia somehow might have survived. Everybody was fascinated that in 1984 we have the Winter Olympics in Sarajevo. And people who went to Sarajevo, they were impressed by the so-called collaborative spirit and how all the people of the former of Yugoslavia seemed to understand and respect each other. And then suddenly by 1991 we begin to experience a shock. And indeed the dissolution of Yugoslavia came as a tremendous shock to the world, or at least to a good many people who did not know some of the undercurrents that were at work in Yugoslavia, even during the time when a lot of people called themselves Yugoslavs instead of Serbs, Croats, Montenegrins, Slovenes, or Macedonians, not to say anything about Kosovars. Now, I think really when you look at this experiment, you marvel on the one hand at the outcome of wars. And at the same time, really, you marvel at how very little we learn from wars. You see, I'm basically speaking about Greece and Yugoslavia because in many respects, there are two very sad footnotes to the ravaged century that you and I have witnessed. Well, I have witnessed over half of this century in a way that I remember it. You witnessed a little bit longer, some of you, than the one I have witnessed. But this indeed, as Robert Conquest described in a book, this is a ravaged century, the 20th century. Something like 160 million people actually suffered as a result of wars, persecutions, and other things in the 20th century. It's an incredible amount when you stop and think of it. 160 million people. This has been one, theoretically, of the most civilized centuries in the world. At the same time, I want to keep in mind that this civilized century, which cost us something like 160 million people, it has also a good deal of all these uncivilized acts. It takes place really in the most civilized part of Europe. I'm anxious to point that out really, because a lot of people are very eager to make reference to the Balkans and the Near East and other parts of the world as being necessarily a little bit less civilized, and therefore condemned to their barbarous acts. They did pay, it is true, for their acts. For example, Yugoslavia, get this down, Yugoslavia lost 2 million people in the First World War. The first Yugoslavia cost us 2 million people to be set up. The second World War also cost 2 million people. The population of that country was, say, in the 1980s, approximately 23 million people. So that gives you an idea, in other words, of the percentage of people who are going to suffer. In the case of Greece, for example, a country of approximately 7 million people during the Second World War, they are going to lose something like 600,000 people. That's almost 7% of the population of the country. Now, we are talking, in other words, about a part of the world that is going to pay its price, as it were, or its share. It's going to make its contribution and its share to this barbarity of the 20th century of the 160 million people that have suffered. But at the same time, they are not, in any sense of the word, any more barbarous than the rest of the world. In the list, for example, I chose not to put some books that really put this emphasis. The emphasis, in other words, that the Balkans are really condemned to barbarous behavior because they are barbaric. So let them exterminate each other. I think that's a very unfortunate generalization. And I do not really care whether you speak about the Croats or about the Slovenes or about the Kosovars. What I have really learned by looking at the Balkan crisis, and especially the Balkan crisis, not only the recent crisis, but especially during the war, is that for all practical purposes, these people become inhuman and barbaric because of the exigencies of barbaric behavior sometimes that surrounds them. That they are not in themselves really all that barbaric. Anyway, my purpose then this evening is to give you a little bit of a story of how Yugoslavia and Greece found itself enmeshed in this conflagration of the Second World War. How it was really part of a bigger plot of Europe. And finally, to see the kind of the price they paid, how they dealt with it, and how the outside world dealt with it as well. I wish to begin, therefore, however, with that point that, for all practical purposes, I promised from the very beginning I would do in order to pay homage to Harold Deutsch. Just about a month before Hitler attacked the Soviet Union, in June, that is to say, of 1941, the British ambassador to Moscow writes in his diary the following: I'm reading at breakfast now a life of Tsar Alexander and his entanglement with Napoleon at the time of Tilsit and after. In his diary, he also goes on to say, and it is really very remarkable how similar the strategy of Hitler is vis-à-vis Russia to that of Napoleon vis-à-vis Alexander. It looks very much sometimes as if history would repeat itself. When I read this, I thought immediately, of course, of Harold Deutsch's first book, The Origins of Napoleonic Imperialism. For those of you who know a little bit about the Napoleonic Wars, and especially the Napoleonic invasion of Russia, basically you remember that that was for the Russians anyway the Great Patriotic War, the first Great Patriotic War. But what is really important for me is that some of the reasons that the ambassador is now noting in his diary as reminding very much of what was going on in approximately 1941, some of those reasons are really pretty much the same. And they engulf, and this is the point I want to make, they engulf not only Eastern Europe, not only, in other words, Napoleonic's push against Russia through Smolensk in order, in other words, to crush Alexander I. It also included what we call nowadays the Balkans, and what we call Southeastern Europe, and what was called in those days the Near East. Pretty much, in other words, exactly the way the picture emerged in 1941. Now, most people, when they think about 1941, and especially about the invasion of the Soviet Union by Hitler, they usually fall in one of two camps. One of those camps, until recently, has been that really the Soviet Union was poorly unprepared, and that for all practical purposes, really Hitler played him to the last minute, and Stalin paid a big price for it. Recently, Soviet historians are putting forth a very revisionistic view. In other words, they say, no, that Stalin was really quite well prepared, and in fact, he himself was planning an attack on Nazi Germany, but he was preempted by the Blitz. Now, there is a third interpretation, which I like very much, that I don't think really that Stalin was thinking a strike against Nazi Germany. Neither do I think that Stalin really was all that unprepared, despite the foolishness he did in doing away with some of his officers and generals during the purges in the 1930s. But I tell you what I think was in the mind of Stalin in 1941. Stalin in 1941 and subsequently demonstrated that he was really not so much of a communist or even an internationalist in 1941, but as a person who really followed very traditional Russian foreign policy objectives. In other words, he knew very well that he was thinking very much about the outcome of the Second World War sooner or later, and he had a fairly important, impressive worldview in mind. And one of the aspects or ingredients of that worldview was really Southeastern Europe, the Balkans, in other words. And I wanted to keep this in mind really because I think of all the world leaders, the only person who really identified that very distinctly was Churchill. Because Churchill repeatedly said that sooner or later, that is a card that the Russians will want to play. And before they play it, why do we play it, in other words, on their table and really work with them on the subject? Well, I really want you to listen to these two remarks, fully aware of the fact that I do not present to you as a military historian, but much more really like a student of maybe social history in the second half of the 20th century. I also want you to realize that normally I do not like to show slides. I do not really enjoy visual aids very much because I have tendency to look at things that I deal with. And yet at the same time I feel I ought to show you a couple of slides to get an idea of the context that I'm going to be moving, or at least the geographic context in which I'm going to take you for a little walk this evening. Therefore, if I can succeed now, I would like to show a few slides here which might help us put a little bit of a geographic context here. First of all, I want you to see a picture really of Europe in 1939, 1940, and the reason why I want you to know this one is because it gives you an idea of the importance, in other words, that Eastern Europe is having to Germany. One of the reasons, of course, why the Allies are going to become a little bit alarmed about the way Hitler's tactics are moving is because they are not going to be able to impose the kind of limitations on Germany that they were hoping to do even after the fall, in other words, of France. Why? Because Eastern Europe is going to have open, or at least the Germans are going to be very eager and hopeful that they are going to get these various, I'm looking for something, yeah. Now here I have to apologize to you because I really am a very prehistoric man. I do not really like all these gadgets. But I do want, nevertheless, to get an idea, really look, for example, at the various sources of supplies, which the Germans are hoping to get from the countries of Eastern Europe, you see, all the way from the oil of Romania, or to the grain of Ukraine, and also the various ores from Yugoslavia and what have you. Almost from each one of these countries of Eastern Europe, the Germans are hoping to extract something. The only place really that the Germans are not going to be able to extract anything, especially in terms of food and what have you, is going to be Greece. Greece, as you know, is a mountainous country, and I think one of the reasons why Greece is going to become important to the Germans later on is going to be strictly for strategic reasons. Actually, I think one of the reasons why Hitler is going to be a little bit hesitant to go into Greece, it is because without strategic reasons, really, he's not going to be able to get much out of Greece, as we'll find out in just a few minutes. So I wanted to get a sense, in other words, of this map to appreciate also the centrality of Yugoslavia and Greece in this tremendous struggle, which is going to involve not only Europe, but also the Mediterranean. Now let's see if I am successful and get another picture here. No? All right. Now this is a map of the naval bases in the Mediterranean. And this now, if you can really see them from where you are going to see that they're interspersed. We have, in other words, the British and especially the Italian in the Mediterranean, especially this becomes very serious after the fall of France. But again here, I want you to see the role of the Soviet Union. I want you to keep thinking of the Balkans, and I want you to see, in other words, how the Balkans are between Italy on the one hand, the Soviet Union on the other, and of course Germany in the north. Now finally, I would like to show you, very quickly, let me show you a couple of, let me see if I can get it down, a couple of other maps. And I just simply want you to see them very quickly, and then I will abandon this enterprise. This map shows Mussolini's invasion of Greece and the counterattack of the Greeks when this takes place in October of 1940, and then finally until March of 1941, when the Germans are going to be forced to come in to aid the Italians, as we shall see. Another map is the German invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece, which is going to begin in April of 1941, and which is going to put a totally new phase on the Balkan Peninsula, as they are going to be engulfed in this long drawn out war and what have you. But I also want to see this map, really, because it's a map of the Red Army's great leap as it really begins to move westwards after 1943, when they are going to really deal at the Battle of Kursk, and then they will be able, in other words, to move westwards, and in fact they're going to come to Warsaw, and then finally, of course, they are going to establish themselves in Romania. And in fact, all these advances of the Red Army are going to show them gradually how they are going to connect their interest in all the way from the north down to the south with regard to a post-World War order and what have you. Let me now, keep that in mind as I now am trying to make some sense out of the contributions of these two countries into the war effort. I think one of the things that hit me as I was preparing for this presentation, and I usually am pretty conscientious about preparation when people ask me to really speak to them. I must admit, though, that this created a lot of problems for me. It created a lot of problems because the subject is so vast to begin with. Secondly, I knew that I was talking to a fairly well-educated audience when it comes to the Second World War. But I said to myself, sometimes it's really amazing. We neglect the obvious sometimes. And one of the most important and obvious realities that oftentimes we do not pay enough attention to, and one of the reasons perhaps that we do not know that much about the Balkan Peninsula, is that these states that emerged in the Balkan Peninsula in 1914, they really were, for all practical purposes, under some kind of an empire all the way down to 1918. And then they start to create all kinds of little alliances in the 1930s, in the hope, in other words, that they were going to be able, for the first time in their long history, to direct their own affairs. The two most important of those alliances, I'm sure all of you have heard about them. One is called the Entente, which was supposed to protect Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Romania. And the other one was the Balkan Entente, which was supposed to protect Yugoslavia, Greece, Romania, and Turkey. These are alliances which were set up in the 1930s. It was one of the ways by which, in other words, and Edvard Beneš of Czechoslovakia said it so nicely and hopefully when he said, now for the first time, Czechoslovakia and the other states, in other words, of Central Europe, don't have to worry that they can be kicked around by the great powers. Little did they realize that as much as they try to create little ententes, they are going to be kicked around, and in fact, really, the ententes are going to become unglued once, really, Nazi Germany began to emerge, not only politically and militarily, but especially economically, and it began to penetrate the markets of all these Balkan states and becoming terribly dependent on Nazi Germany. Well, I want you to remember that in many respects, really, the Balkans were, during the Second World War, and even just before, in many respects, really pawns in the hands of the great powers. It's kind of interesting to me how all of them would like to have played a role in the Balkans, but somehow, with the exception really of Mussolini, was a little bit overeager. And the reason why Mussolini was overeager, as I'm sure you realize, because he was beginning to resent the advances and the accomplishments of Hitler, either against the French or later on as he moved in Eastern Europe. And Mussolini also wanted to show that he too could really have some kind of imperial enterprise. So this is the reason why he's going to incorporate Albania in 1939. And later on, he's going to go into Greece. But with the exception of Italy, really, most of the major powers, they really were almost kind of holding back. They all were opting and hoping for some kind of neutrality in the Balkans, unless it was absolutely necessary for them to use them. I marvel, as I was preparing for these notes, really, how Hitler even was careful not to be too active in the Balkans because he did not want to get the British excited. It's fascinating. It is also kind of interesting to me how many times Hitler wanted to be a little bit too aggressive in Eastern Europe because he didn't want to get the Russians unnecessarily excited until at least December or November of 1940. In other words, the Balkans were there. And in many respects, they were hoping that everybody was going to honor their neutrality or their attitude toward neutrality. The Greeks wanted to remain neutral. The Yugoslavs wanted to remain neutral. The Bulgarians even said so, and the Romanians. But before you know it, you see all of them, without their wanting to, they're going to become involved in the conflagration. And the reason because that part of Europe is so terribly important geopolitically, not only for Eastern Europe, but especially really for the Mediterranean as well. The record, the chronicle, is fairly simple. I'm sure all of you know everything began to work when in August of 1939, the Soviets and the Nazis signed the Non-Aggression Pact, which for all practical purposes, it really did divide Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. But notice this, the Non-Aggression Pact and all the provisions for all practical purposes stopped on the Danube. On the Danube. They did not really make any arrangements. They had not promised anything else to each other. Nothing about Bessarabia, for example, which was very important for Russia. Nothing about Dobruja, which was very important, in other words, to the Bulgarians. In other words, they stopped at the Danube. That reminds me of the book that the British ambassador was reading in 1941, when he said, I'm reminded of all the problems, in other words, that Napoleon and Alexander were facing, confronting with each other in 1812. Pretty much the same kind of rivalries that will emerge, in other words, in 1939, 1940, 1941. Well, so then we have, in other words, a scramble from the Balkans between 1939 and 1941. All of them are trying to create spheres of influences, but they're afraid. Well, ultimately, everything is going to be determined by Hitler's annexation, of course, of Austria, and gradually by dominating Bulgaria and Romania to the extent that it will make them really very easy passages into the rest of the Balkan Peninsula. Now, remember now, that what Hitler was trying to do in 1939, 1940, was hoping to assure his flank, his southern flank, in order when he planned to attack toward the Soviet Union, he would have been protected in the south. He wanted to protect the Mediterranean, as it were, as his Mediterranean flank as well. Now, I don't know if you remember the map which I showed you, the first or the second one, but basically it really goes against the thesis that Hitler was thinking of advancing against the Soviet Union only in terms of Central Eastern Europe. In other words, trying to pinch them in the Blitz and end them there without taking into consideration the southern, the southern flank, which was going to be his as he was advancing into the Soviet Union. The story, it seems to me, is that he was hoping really to move and guarantee himself all the resources in the south. And this is important to keep in mind, because that's why Hitler is going to become embarrassed. For in October 28th of 1940, the Italians are going to blunder. And this was really their biggest military blunder, the invasion of Greece from Albania. They had invaded Albania, remember, in 1939. It was part of their grand expansion, not only in Albania, but also in Ethiopia earlier, and they like to call themselves as being kings of this and kings of that. Well, anyway, now, after having calling themselves king of Albanians as well, they wanted also to dominate Greece. They felt that Greece was going to be an easy prey. Ciano writes in his diaries, the Italian advisor to Mussolini about foreign policy. He writes in his diary, we will be able to deal with the Greeks very easily, because the Greeks really simply don't want to fight. In other words, he thought that the Greeks were much happier really bathing in the blue Mediterranean. Who does not like bathing in the blue Mediterranean? What they did not realize, however, was that the Greeks, with all their faults, really, they happened to be extremely patriotic. And even though they were just emerging out of a dictatorship, just like all the other East European countries, and even though that dictator admired Hitler a little bit, nevertheless, when, I'm talking about Metaxas now, when Mussolini asked Metaxas to really allow them to come in and for all practical purposes accept suzerainty of the Italians, he said that resounding no. October 28th of 1940. To this very day, it's a national holiday in Greece, because not only they said no to the Italians, But the strangest thing happened that really surprised the rest of Europe. The Italians really were pushed back into Albania from where they came. And for all practical purposes, the Greeks were able, within a couple of weeks, to incorporate and to control the part which the Greeks always called Northern Epirus, and the Albanians called Southern Albania. And it looked, in other words, and this introduces you really to the niceties of the complexity of that region anyway. But the point is that this becomes an extremely embarrassing moment for the Axis powers. Not just for Mussolini, but also for Hitler. Because this is going to create a problem for Hitler in view of the fact that he was already making his plans, really, to move against the Soviet Union. You see, what I'm trying to impress upon you is that there's a tremendous connection between Operation Barbarossa, which is the one that, of course, is going to lay out all the plans against the Soviet Union, and Operation Maritza, which is going to be the one which is going to go down into Yugoslavia and into Greece, and which will take place in April 6th of 1941. Hitler had planned that these things would have taken place a little bit earlier. He did not count, in other words, on the embarrassment of Mussolini's troops in Greece. Therefore, that is going to become delayed. Now, I am not, even though I am Greek really, I'm not going to advance the argument. But I would like to invoke Harold Deutsch again, who just before he passed away, his last book, which he put together, was a what-if book. And that what-if book is really a fascinating, because oftentimes historians do not like to ask those questions, because they say history cannot be written in the past subjunctive. And of course history cannot be written in the past subjunctive. But it's worthwhile to ask the question in others. What if? What if? Well, the what if question with regard to this particular time, what if, in other words, if Mussolini was successful? And what if, in other words, if Hitler really had embarked upon his invasion of the Soviet Union in April instead of June? That might have really turned things around, at least for a while. And secondly, my friends, I'm going to ask the bigger question in order to move things forward. What if, in other words, in 1941, from April 6th, when we are going to have the invasion, Operation Maritza, which is going to be the invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece, and this time not just by incompetent Italians, because Hitler at one point he said there are only three statesmen in Europe that count. He said myself, always first, Stalin, and Mussolini. However, he said really Mussolini is not all that bright anyway, he said. He has not even been able to deal with the Catholic Church effectively. And so he says the only two people that count is myself and Stalin. And that's one reason he says he decided to sign the Non-Aggression Pact in 1939. But in April, remember now, April 6th of 1941, to me it's even more important for purposes of discussion than say June 22, 1941. Because in April 6th of 1941, that's when, in other words, the German forces are going to move down through Yugoslavia and all the way down to Greece. It was one of the speediest, one of the most amazing conquering moves of any time in history. I know that people say Yugoslavia fell between the 5th, the 6th, and the 15th. Not only Yugoslavia, but the entire Greece had fallen. And after we had the invasion of Crete, which were airborne divisions parachuted into Crete and what have you. Now, what people do not seem to realize is that really that war was over within 72 hours. It took 3 weeks, to be sure, to bring the German troops in. But within 72 hours, both Yugoslavia and Greece, for all practical purposes, lay prostrate. Why? Because immediately on the 6th, Hitler bombarded Belgrade, like Belgrade had not been bombarded until the Third Balkan War, which was our war. As a matter of fact, when you talk really to the Yugoslav people today, especially to the Serbs, and they speak about Balkan wars, this is parenthetical, but I always like to talk in parentheses, the Serbs will tell you something to this effect. We poor Balkan people, they tell you, we really had 3 Balkan wars. One was the Balkan Wars that liberated us from the Turks and the Austro-Hungarians, and we became independent states. The second Balkan Wars is the one that we fought against the Germans. And the third Balkan War is the one that we'll be fighting against NATO. Well, anyway, this second Balkan War that we are talking about that has taken place, you see, and which is going to be the result of Hitler and, of course, of Italian activities as well, and which is within 72 hours they're going to bring this decision. But here is the big question. Suppose, if I'm going to follow Harold Deutsch's model, suppose, in other words, Greece and Yugoslavia allowed them not only to go through, but also allowed them to stay there without any resistance. What if, in other words, Greece and Yugoslavia were Bulgaria and Romania? What if, in other words, they did not put up the ferocious resistance? And I'd like now, if I may, as part of this scenario that I'm presenting to you this evening, since I'm interested very much in the impact of wars, let me just take a few minutes and tell you that there are a lot of similarities between Greece and Yugoslavia. There are some differences, but there are a lot of similarities in the way they responded really to the German invasion. In both countries, there was a ferocious resistance movement against the invader. In both countries. Really. In fact, really, there was one in Albania too. But oftentimes we forget that the resistance movements in Greece and Yugoslavia was incredibly ferocious. In both countries, nobody thought that they were going to really be able to build up, because there was a ferocious division among the resistant troops as well. All right? There, first of all, there are going to be all those individuals who in the beginning you thought they are really going to be against the German invaders as such. But in both countries, those who are going to be resisting are going to be concerned about one very important question. What will be the outcome of the war? What kind of government are we going to have? Are we going to bring the kings back? Because both in Yugoslavia and in Greece, the kings are going to be forced to go in exile. We are going to have governments in exile in Cairo and in England. So the big question for all these people is going to be, are we going to bring the kings back? Or are we going to form a new kind of government which is going to be more democratic? In other words, this is going to be a very important issue which is going to divide the resistance movements, both in Yugoslavia and in Greece. In Yugoslavia, I'm sure all of you know, that's going to be the Chetniks, under a fellow by the name of Dragan Mihailovic. Well, Mihailovic, for example, is going to be a little bit conservative. He's going to be hoping that after the war, for all practical purposes, the king is going to come back. But then there will be the partisans. And the partisans are going to be those who are going to be helped by Tito, who in the beginning most people thought could not possibly put this act together. But ultimately, from 10,000, he's going to have a force of nearly 200,000, and he's going to be the driving force. Finally, of course, in Yugoslavia, you're also going to have another very unfortunate phenomenon, which we do not like to talk very much, but I think we must point it out right now, because it's going to leave its mark for the rest of the century. And that is the role of Croatia. Because Croatia, really, at this time, it is going to play, and I don't know how many of you from that part of the world come from Croatia, and I tried to disarm criticism from the very beginning by pointing out to you that for all practical purposes, these people live together more than they fought each other. They know how to coexist. But when you are really facing a crisis like they are facing, and they're manipulated by outside powers, which accentuate the domestic problems, then these people indeed bring the worst. This brings the worst out of them. And the Croatians, really, who wanted very much to be an independent state. And in fact, an independent state, not only independent, but also get rid of the Serbs in Croatia. They are going to embark really in one of the bloodiest and most intolerant behavior during the Second World War anywhere in Europe. I want you to be able to keep this in mind, because something like 200,000 Serbs are going to be executed or assassinated or done in at this particular time. Many of them are going to be expelled. In fact, really, it was in Croatia where we have the first program of ethnic cleansing in Europe during soon after the invasion of Germany in the Balkan Peninsula and what have you. Now, this is neither to really give a black eye on the Croats, not to exonerate the Serbs for their behavior in the recent crisis, but it's a matter of really putting down the record, as it were, so people can understand why these people are bringing a tremendous baggage with them when they're dealing with contemporary crisis. And let me just tell you something else. The Germans are going to be every bit as bad as the Croatians in Serbia. In other words, they are going to do what they're going to do in Greece later on. For every German killed, there will be at least 100 Serbs that must be killed according to German law. For every German wounded, 50 Serbs will be killed. Now, of course, there will be a moment there will be no males left in some of these villages, because most of the men are going to go up to the mountains as they form the resistance movements. And we do have evidence, as a matter of fact, that in Serbia, when they could not find adults, they would take school children. And one case, in one of the towns, they're going to execute 2,000 school children in order to pay for the kind of penalty that the adult population should pay and what have you. So we are really having a real civil war on our hands as well as a resistance movement. The same thing is happening in Greece. Now, in the case of Greece, we are going to have the communists. We are not going to have the kind of division in Greece that we have in Yugoslavia. In other words, there is not going to be the religious differences between the Croats and the Serbs, or the differences between the Croats, the Serbs, and the Bosnians, or the Muslim population in the area, what have you. Neither do the Greeks really have to deal with the Albanians within their own borders, although the Greeks are also concerned very much about the fact that the Germans gave Macedonia to the Bulgarians, for example. And the Bulgarians are moving people into Macedonia, which belonged to the Greeks at that time. Also, I think it's very important to keep in mind that for all practical purposes, we are going to see that a lot of people in Macedonia now, they are going to be toying with the idea of possibly moving either to Bulgaria or to Albania. In other words, that part, which today is known as Macedonia, is going to go to either Albania or to Bulgaria. Greece is having those kinds of problems, but it does not have the problem of Yugoslavia in terms of religious division, because it was a much more homogeneous society. Anyway, whether it was the Greeks or whether it was the Yugoslavs, involving as they were in a very ferocious resistance against the Central Powers, that, my friends, was an important detail in the Second World War. It really held them there until 1944. Until 1944. And this is going to be an embarrassment, and at the same time, after a while, a costly enterprise for the Central Powers, which is going to loom even larger when, of course, the Allies begin to invade Italy, and so on. Now, let me now very quickly point out to some of the consequences of this, because I'm very much interested, in other words, in what happens as a result of the war. I'm interested, I told you, in the origins of wars. I'm interested in the process of war, and more important than that, I'm interested in the legacy of wars, and especially how that legacy, for example, might affect the world in which we live today. The second Yugoslavia came to an end, as you know, in 1941, but surprisingly, it's going to come back to life in 1945. And it's going to come back to life in 1945 in a remarkable way, because Tito is going to survive, and Tito is going to be able to survive, and is going to keep, really, the Russian Red Army from getting into Yugoslavia and providing the kind of help that the Russians gave, say, to the Romanians or to the Bulgarians, and what have you. Yugoslavia is going to be the only country, in other words, in Southern Europe, which is going to put itself together right after the war into the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. They will have a referendum. They will have a plebiscite. The king is not going to come back to Yugoslavia. Therefore, we are going to have the emergence, in other words, of federalism in Yugoslavia, as opposed, in other words, to an enlarged Serbia or an enlarged cleansed Croatia and what have you. So this federal system of Yugoslavia is going to include from the north-south Slovenia. Somebody in fact said, really, Yugoslavia begins and ends with Slovenia. Anyway, Slovenia, in other words, it began as a state, it ended as a state with Slovenia. Anyway, Slovenia in the north, you see. Croatia following, you see. Bosnia-Herzegovina. Then we also have Serbia a little further inside. And finally, of course, Montenegro and Macedonia, which is going to incorporate also the province of Kosovo. This is really a remarkable accomplishment after the Second World War. Most people didn't think it was going to take place. And not only that it took place is remarkable, but that it took place almost with a defiant attitude toward the Soviet Union. Very few people seem to remember nowadays that really Tito made it very clear to Stalin that maybe we are going to imitate certain things of the Soviet Union. But in some areas, you have made mistakes, and maybe we are going to have our own road to socialism as it came to be known. Remember, this was something which ultimately cost Tito an expulsion from the Comintern in 1948. The expulsion from the Comintern of Tito, however, is very important for you to keep in mind because of what is happening further south in Greece. In the case of Greece, we are going to have the king return to Greece. This is going to throw the country, after the resistance, into a civil war, which is going to be even more costly for the Greeks than the German occupation. The Greeks are going to fight 3 rounds of a civil war between 1944 and 1949. The worst being 1946 to 1949. And why this civil war? It was a civil war because the communists in Greece were the best armed and the best disciplined, just like the communists were in Yugoslavia. And it's really fascinating and very moving to see how disciplined these armies were when all is said and done. Anyway, the Greeks are going to fight among themselves because the communists have not as yet got wind of the agreement or the intentions of Stalin, that for all practical purposes, the Balkans were divided, and the only part that's going to remain into Western or British influence and American influence is going to be Greece. The Greek communists are fighting, thinking that they're going to get support from the Soviet Union and from the other countries of Eastern Europe. It's not going to work that way. But what is important for you and me to remember is that this is going to be a vicious civil war. It's going to cost the Greeks more dead and wounded than the Germans are going to inflict upon them. Civil wars are always ugly. But this civil war is going to be brought about partly because the Second World War, remember this now, the whole situation is the Balkans in the Second World War, the impact of this war on these societies. The Second World War is also going to destroy a lot of the old world which the Greeks have known. With the result, in other words, that many people will hope that they are going to have a chance at a pluralistic society, where, in other words, they are going to be able not to be dependent entirely on the old political elite of the 1930s and what have you. Now, in Greece, as opposed to Yugoslavia, the Allies, especially the British, in the beginning, and later the Americans, were concerned as to the form of government that there was going to be there. There is a very interesting conversation between Churchill and the British envoy to Yugoslavia who was dealing with Tito. This English envoy to Yugoslavia, McQueen was his name, he was telling Churchill, you know, I had a very good conversation with Tito. In fact, Tito told me a great deal about what he hopes to do after the war. In a way, Tito is going to rule in the name of the king after the war, until finally there will be a vote where the king is not going to come back to Yugoslavia anymore. And he said to him, this is McLean speaking to Churchill, I have a feeling, he said to him, you know, Yugoslavia is going to go the way of the Eastern Bloc, and it is going to be pretty much like the Soviet Union with some changes. And Churchill said to him, you know, he said to him, you seem to be very much impressed by Tito. Well, let me ask you this. Do you plan to move to Yugoslavia at the end of the war? And McLean said to him, no, I think I'm going to stay in England. In that case, he said to him, what do you care what form of government is going to be in Yugoslavia as long as the Yugoslavs continue to help us to really defeat the Germans? But when it came to Greece, it was different. Churchill, for some reason or other, wanted to be involved in Greece. He believed that Greece, because of that map, was infinitely more important because of the ports in the Aegean Islands and what have you, infinitely more important for the preservation of British imperial interests in the Mediterranean. Secondly, he kind of liked the Greek king, King George. And thirdly, he said, listen, he said, we may suffer in Greece, but it will be even more of an embarrassment if we do not try to help the Greeks. For some reason or other, in other words, Churchill is going to become very involved in the case of the Greeks. Well, anyway, regardless of all the attempts, and especially the British and later the Americans, with the Truman Doctrine, which, my friends, it is going to make it possible for the Greeks to stay out of the bloc, the Soviet bloc. Greece is going to be the only country in Southeastern Europe that is not going to become a satellite. And Yugoslavia is going to be the only country in Southeastern Europe that, even though within the socialist bloc, it is going to demonstrate some kind of an independence. And I think that has a lot to do with the type of resistance and their role during the Second World War. Let me conclude now by telling you what is the general impact that this had on these two societies. An impact which, in many respects, explains why Greece is where it is today and Yugoslavia is where it is today also. In the first place, I think, in both countries, the Second World War gave a great, first of all, in both countries, but especially in Yugoslavia, the infrastructure and the economy was ruined. I could give you statistics here, but time does not permit. I mean, whole villages were destroyed, you see. The main population of villages was gone. Even in the 1960s, when I used to visit villages in Southern Europe, Southeastern Europe, I would find villages that were inhabited only by old women. There were no men because the men had been killed during the Second World War. So the destruction was bad in both countries. But let me tell you some of the positive things that happened. In the first place, it gave a section of those societies a chance to participate in a major way in a political, social, as well as military movement. That is the peasantry. The peasantry, for the first time, is going to participate very actively, both in Yugoslavia and in Greece, in setting up the Liberation Army, in setting up the resistance movements and what have you. Secondly, and this is very important, it will give women, and this is fascinating to me, long before women would read anything about feminism and equal rights and what have you, they will in fact be acting as equal with males. Many of these women are going to participate as partisans. They will have their own battalion, some of them. And the discipline among these women in the mountains is really incredible. So in many ways, the war that is going to give this opportunity for the expansion of the section of the population that will participate in the post-World War era. And secondly, the women also will be very actively involved in this area as well. Thirdly, I think in both countries, they all of a sudden are going to find out that the young people are going to become much more involved. This in Yugoslavia as well as in Greece. In other words, this is really almost putting or cutting themselves off from the pre-1941 era, as it were. And finally, and this is very important, in the case of the Greeks, they are going to experience an unfortunate division between the royalists and the liberals, or between, after the war, the communists and the royalists. Really, there is going to be, in the case of Greece, a strange kind of silence about the role of the communists during the war, that it is not going to be lifted until approximately 1974. In other words, it is going to be some kind of a censorship, not to talk about the participation of the Greeks in the resistance movement, or if you do, they were traitors. Because in the final analysis in 1949, it is going to be the right, or those supported by the West, that will win in Greece, whether by the Truman Doctrine or what have you. And let me just remind you this. The closing of the border in 1948 by Tito, and that's, I told you, it's connected with what's happening in Greece. It's going to make it almost impossible for the Greek guerrillas to go into Yugoslavia and recuperate and come back and fight the Allied forces and the non-communist forces in Greece. In fact, nearly after 1948, something strange happened. which many of you may know and many of you may not know, but I think it's worth mentioning. Thousands and thousands of Greek children are really going to be herded or harried across the borderlines of the communist dominated countries now. In other words, it's kind of a second child tribute, as it were. Many of these people, in other words, they are going to leave Greece. Many of them are political immigrants. Many of them are children. All of them are going to wind up in East European countries, all the way from Poland to Romania, Bulgaria, and many of them in Tashkent in the Soviet Union. These are, in other words, the people who were supporting the communists during the resistance movement and during the Civil War. These people are going to be silenced, and they are not going to be able to come back to Greece until after 1974, many of them returning after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So the country, in other words, of Greece, is going to experience this kind of division. In the case of Yugoslavia, we are going to see the magnificent leadership of Tito, rearranging, in other words, and putting all these 6 republics together in the hope that somehow people are going to start thinking of themselves as Yugoslavs, Southern Slavs, and not as Croats, Slovenes, Herzegovins, and what have you. Many people maintain that really one of the legacies of the Second World War was the possibility for a viable Yugoslavia. And that for all practical purposes, many people thought, up to 1984, as I told you, people were hopeful that in Sarajevo, the Winter Olympics was evidence that maybe things could happen and we can avoid the collapse which we witnessed in 1991. Now then the question is, why did we have that kind of a turmoil in Yugoslavia following 1991, which led, in other words, to the imbroglio which ultimately got us involved in the part of the world. And when it happened 3 years ago, I did say that we are going to be there 30 years from now, and many people thought I was crazy, and now I'm hearing even many American statements say, as much as we hate to admit it, maybe we are going to be here much longer than originally planned. Why? Perhaps we fail to understand the dynamics, the local dynamics of this region of the Balkans, Yugoslavia, all the way down to the Mediterranean, which was, I remind you again, the only part of the Balkans during the Second World War which consciously resisted the Axis powers in their attempts to really use it as springboards either in the Mediterranean or in their attempts to move eastwards against the Soviet Union. I go back now to the statement of the British ambassador, because we think, as well as with the whole thing, we paid some kind of a testimony both to the realities, in other words, of the war in 1812 and in 1945, and finally, of course, to Harold Deutsch himself, who had a magisterial way of presenting history. And he was able really to move comfortably from ancient history to the Napoleonic Wars, to the Second World War, in the way really that many young historians would wish they could emulate, even in a little detail, by way of a footnote. And certainly, all I hope I accomplish this evening is to put a little footnote to the heritage and to the legacy of Harold C. Deutsch, who was very much interested in the role of wars and their role in affecting and in transforming societies, and how we need to study them, if for no other reason, to understand ourselves as well as other societies. Thank you very much.
Well, as the program noted, we were supposed to have two American veterans speaking this evening, and let me just give a little bit of their story, if I can. Henry Flash was I think a navigator in a B-24 on a bombing raid into German-occupied countries. His plane was hit, and again, I can't remember whether he crash landed or bailed out. But anyway, he landed on the ground in Yugoslavia. He was helped to evade the Germans by partisans. He was taken into their custody, and I remember one story that was very marked to him, and it's actually a very sad story. He went on a couple of the missions. I don't think it's fair to say that he participated with the partisans, but he certainly was an observer to the partisan resistance, as Theo talked about tonight, to see how they held down the German troops. And I have heard a number, and you can confirm this later, but again, you mentioned the delay from April to June of launching Operation Barbarossa. But the story that I've heard is that there were 35 German divisions that were tied down because of this resistance of the partisans of Yugoslavia. I don't want to be held that number, but it was a large German force, which of course, if they could have gone 2 months earlier with that force, could have certainly made a big what-if difference in the outcome of the Russian campaign. But Henry had a souvenir that was given to him by Tito. And I remember the story, a sad story, that he guarded that very, very, valued it very, very highly, because it was given to him by Tito. And his house was broken into, and it was picked up. I mean, it wasn't that it was a gold ring or anything like that, but it was a memento that meant something to him, as many of you will appreciate, something maybe of not great value, has great sentimental attachment. But it was taken with the other items, and of course never found. Henry was eventually evacuated out, and was a businessman here in the Twin Cities. Again, he had hip replacement surgery recently and was not able to navigate the weather and things that he did. I hope I've done justice to his story. Another gentleman that that I met and spent some time with last week, a fellow by the name of Joe Sinta. His parents immigrated from Yugoslavia to Ely, Minnesota. And Joe used to tell me that some of the street fights in Ely, Minnesota were like the street fights in the Balkans between the Croats and the Slovenians and the other Balkan origins. Joe was a pilot in the 2nd Bomb Group, 429th Bomb Squadron. He was based in Amendola, and on his 21st mission, he was coming back, was hit. They had to abandon the plane. The crew all got out of the plane. The one sad story, and I actually have a slide that I won't show because I think we'll probably have Joe here another time. But the only person that died was his tail gunner. Apparently the tail gunner failed to pull his ripcord. The other people did bail out, landed successfully on the ground. They were gathered together again by another partisan group, not Tito's, but another partisan group. And the leader of that, his name was Vojko Anacic. Joe when he parachuted, you know, they taught him how to fly, but they didn't teach him how to parachute real well. Those of you that may have that recollection. When he landed, his heel hit a rock, and he jammed his heel bone up into his ankle bone, and he was hard to walk, obviously. These partisans, over 51 days, led them out of the mountains of Yugoslavia down to the coast, and he was able to, with the partisans, commandeer a German boat of some kind. They actually attacked it, captured it, got the 9 remaining Americans on the ship, and took them back to Italy. The one person that did die from his crew was buried. He was buried on a hillside in Yugoslavia, and that was reported to the graves registration, and Joe did not know if he had ever been evacuated. So there's always a story that maybe doesn't get finalized. He went back to Yugoslavia in 1978, and he had a picture book of the places he visited. He had a picture of the partisan leader that rescued him, who has now died, and he also is doing genealogy on his family, and visited with some of his descendants that had remained alive in Yugoslavia. I talked to Bob Clemens, who was very active with our 15th Air Force program a year or so ago, and I will give you their names and hope that you will get them to infiltrate your Wednesday luncheon groups. They're great fellows, and will be a great addition to your group. Let's open it up for a few questions. Theo, why don't you come up? Why don't you come up, and are there any questions that you might have on the topic of the evening?
Before you ask the question, may I say something? Because his remarks prompted me to remember something that I meant to say in my statement. I left it out. And that once Hitler came down into Yugoslavia, many people argue. Yeah, sorry. Many people argue that he made 2 mistakes there. One of the mistakes was that he really did take some of those troops out in order to direct them to the Eastern Front. And that was, among other things, what gave Tito a chance to really build up his partisan group. The other one, they say, one mistake that Hitler really committed there is that perhaps he should have followed the descent into Yugoslavia and Greece by attacking the British in the Mediterranean. And many of the British evacuated Crete, as you know, and they took some of their people to North Africa, especially Egypt, and some of them on the island of Cyprus. Now, some people argue that that was a tactical mistake as well, that he could have waited a little bit longer for Eastern Europe. But when you made that reference, I remember those 2 points that I made in objection. Yes, sir.
I've heard or read that there were German POWs in Yugoslavia that were not released until 1948.
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah,
That's correct.
The gentleman said that there were prisoners of war, German prisoners of war in Yugoslavia that were not released until 1948, and that is correct. But you know, one of the things that I did not state here, and it was not clear, is that in 1941, when the Germans came in and they divided Yugoslavia among themselves, that involved an awful lot of transfer of population. And a lot of Germans came, in fact, into Yugoslavia. And that was one of the ways by which they were captured as well. Let me just remind you how it approximately went. Croatia was supposed to be self-independent, but of course under German control, but independent nevertheless. Then a good deal of Slovenia, which is about Croatia, was divided between Germany and Italy. The coastline of the whole Dalmatia and then all the way down to Montenegro, all that was going to Italy too. So for all practical purposes, they had control of the littoral. Serbia was put entirely under German control. And Montenegro and Bosnia-Herzegovina was mostly under German, but some of it under the Italians. So, and then what we have happening there also is a lot of movement of population, some of it because of ethnic cleansing policy by one or another group. Also because many people were brought from there into Germany to work, you know, and if they were Jews, of course, to be dealt with. And there were 30,000 Jews, for example, in Croatia, who were dealt with very savagely and taken into concentration into the camps in Europe. But as you moved some of those people out, then there were a lot of Germans that were sent there to change the demographics of the region, as well as to participate in the war effort. So it is both the invading forces and the other people that were moving the territory that were captured. But which explains why this region becomes so terribly complex. I mean, we are just touching the surface of the mosaic that made Yugoslavia. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I think we're pretty fortunate here tonight to come out in this snowstorm and see reincarnation. I'm not talking about the Greeks, Aristotle and Pericles and Socrates, but the Greek historian Thucydides in the year 514, I think, completed his history of the Peloponnesian Wars. And the idea behind that history was that unless we know history, we are bound to repeat it. So Dr. Thucydides, thank you very much for telling us tonight and giving us a little bit of idea that what we've done in the past, we will bound to repeat unless we learn from it. Thank you, Dr. Thucydides.
Just a question, how was Tito able to keep the Red Army out of the Yugoslavia?
Well, it was partly Stalin himself. It was partly an agreement. He says we're going to liberate and we're going to reach Belgrade together. It was part of the agreement as they allowed them to move westwards, the Allies as well as Tito. But also really because Yugoslavia was pretty far, and Stalin did not want to spread himself any more than he was already spread. It was both a practical. Stalin was really a terribly calculating individual, very careful. I start off my presentation by telling you that really people are revising the abuse of Stalin as a tactician. And a lot of people, in other words, I told you the three views, but the last view is very important, and I'm glad you asked that question, because if you notice, pretty much, all the concerns that Alexander I had about Eastern Europe when Napoleon was coming in are exactly the concerns that Stalin had when Hitler started moving eastward. In other words, he wanted to assure a strong position. And the setting up of the People's Republic in Eastern Europe, in many respects, really was the outcome of a strategy that he had in mind when he became involved in the war. Now, Tito, Yugoslavia is a much tougher country than Bulgaria. You can move right into Bulgaria. You can walk over into Romania. It's so close, you see they have the... But also, Stalin was not really sure what he wanted to do with Macedonia. And that is really a very important, that Macedonia there, not the Macedonia that we got now. The communists among themselves were divided on that. So after a while, really, he felt that he's probably going to get into more difficulties in Yugoslavia than if he had stayed on the outside. And it also gave the impression to the Allies that he was not being unreasonable. And these guys really accuse of suspicion of each other. I mean, as they negotiate, whether it's at Tehran or at Yalta, constantly they are suspicious of each other even while they are making deals, as it were. So I think it's a combination of the ruggedness of the country, the distance from the Soviet Union, the personality of Tito, and the very fact, and this is very important, that by 1945, don't forget, Tito is very well armed. He got all the things that the Italians left behind. This is another very important point that I left out in my presentation. Both in the case of Greece and of Yugoslavia, the resistance movements are really going to become very, very well armed, not by the special missions that are going to go in to help them, but by that which they capture from the retreating Central Powers. So he is really very well armed by 1945. So he's going to be able to put a fight. He could not deal, of course, with the Red Army, but it was not going to be fun for Stalin to get bogged down in the Balkans the way Hitler was bogged down. Yes, sir.
Was Tito a Stalin-styled communist?
Well, Tito, as I tried to say, Tito was from Croatia, as I said. He fought in the First World War in the Austro-Hungarian Empire army. He liked very much to dress like a Hungarian. He just loved to really give this facade, so on. And when he was caught a prisoner, he went to Russia in the interwar years. He was schooled there, he came back. And he was really a very staunch and merciless communist. I mean, Tito was not a Sunday school teacher. I mean, and as a matter of fact, really, once the Germans moved out and they started coming down from the mountains, I mean, one of the first things which they did was started cleansing up all those villages from anybody who was suspected of being a collaborator, whether he was actual or potential. They really cleansed them absolutely mercilessly. And he put on their own people in place. Yeah, he was very vicious, there's no doubt about it. But remember that was a Croatian. And I like to say that, you see, because I told you in the beginning, they say that the second Yugoslavia was almost created by a Croatian, you see, imposed on Serbia. Yeah. Well, he was a tough guy, and Stalin really miscalculated. I mean, Stalin has made the famous statement that I'll move my little finger, and Tito will fall. Well, he survived, he outlived him, as you know. Admittedly, the West helped Tito a great deal economically, because we thought that it was the one place where we could provide some kind of help there. We could not do it as openly as we could do it in Greece, in other words. I mean, Greece really became the largest beneficiary of Western aid between 1945 and 1962. What came to be known as the Greek economic miracle, or the survival, the staying out of the communist bloc, could not have been done without the help of the West. There's no doubt about it. But Tito was a tough customer. Yes?
Which, you mentioned that the royal houses of each country ended up in exile in Greece and England. Which ended up where and how much influence?
The king of Greece, soon after the invasion of Wakefield, from there, they left and went to Crete. From Crete, they went to Cairo. So there's a Greek government in exile in Cairo. In the case of King Peter of Yugoslavia, they first, get this now, they first went from Yugoslavia to Greece before the Germans really took over entirely, and from there to England. And they formed their own government in exile. So you see, the story is that they have the government in exile which represented in England the various republics or ethnic groups in Yugoslavia as well. So we have the government in exile. We have Quisling governments at home, collaborating with the Germans. We have the resistance movements. We have the various ideologies who are defining the resistance movements and are thinking of a post-World War settlement defined by their own ideology. I mean, it is really a very messy situation. It's not like a war with clearly defined fronts. Civil wars are really not good stories to talk about. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that there had been some revisionism. You mentioned that there was revisionism going on about Stalin. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, since the fall of the Soviet Union, have you personally found materials that have caused you to alter your courses
Well, that's a very good question, and I will talk about it. May I preface it with something else? In the case of Yugoslavia, since we're talking about Yugoslavia, the history of the Second World War is very poorly documented because most of the documents were destroyed. Libraries, and even the armies themselves, when they came in, they just destroyed everything, okay? So, and then after the war, what do we have? We have Serbian historians, and we have Croatian historians. In a way, they were kept undercover by Tito, trying to come up with a national history of Yugoslavia, which would be really accommodating to everybody. But once this thing exploded again, after 91, then everybody's beginning to write their own version, with all kinds of exaggerations and what have you. In the case of Greece, we have the unfortunate situation of the kind of censorship on the left. You couldn't really allow anybody to talk who had participated in the resistance movement with the left. The secretary of the Communist Party of Greece, for example, wound up in the Soviet Union. He died in Sorgu, in Siberia, after he got in trouble with Khrushchev, because he was too much of a Stalinist, can you imagine? Now, coming back now to the question, however, which you raised, and this is really a very good question. All this new information that's coming out of Soviet archives now, is it really helping us revise our understanding of either Soviet politics or Soviet foreign policy? In my estimation, in the overall scheme of things, I don't think we are going to change our views that much. Frankly, I'm amazed by how well American scholars and Western scholars have understood the system and spoken about it. But we are getting more information, a lot more information, which was in the KGB archives, and which for some reason or other they wouldn't really divulge. For example, let me give you an idea. In 1935, they took a survey of religious faith in the Soviet Union. Okay, I mean, a religious belief in the Soviet Union. They found out that about 60% of the population in 1936 still, they said that they believed. They had some kind of faith in Supreme Being. Well, it didn't really make much sense for that statistic to be let out in 1936. So that was put in the KGB archives, and was discovered only recently by some friends of mine, as a matter of fact, who are working on the church in the 1930s. So this tells us a great deal about certain of the insecurities of the regime. I think we learned certain specific things, such as the Katyn massacre, you know, the thing in Poland, you know, where a lot of Polish officers were buried in massive graves. And the Russians always advanced the theory that that was done by Germans as they were moving eastwards. Well, now the evidence and the Russian historians themselves admit that that really was done by Russians as they were moving westwards before the Germans really moved eastwards, in other words, when they moved to take over that part which they thought was legitimately there as a result of the non-aggression pact. So in these kinds of things, yes, we're getting. Now, for example, in some respects, however, it is really a little bit more information. Now, let me give you an idea now. I don't know if Richard is still here or he left. Now, for example, Richard Pipes, a very famous American historian from Harvard University, who trained a lot of students and who was decidedly anti-Soviet, a person who, but nevertheless a very important scholar, who's written a number of books, recently a series of books on the Russian Revolution and the Soviet regime. He edited and wrote a preface about a book called The Unknown Lenin, The Unknown Lenin. And in it really, he published some documents in which he showed how ferocious Lenin could be with some groups inside Russia in 1918 to 1921. Now, how revealing is that? I mean, those of us who studied Lenin, but he presents it as really being something new. It's not really that new. I mean, Lenin was a dedicated revolutionary, a grand tactician. He believed in the revolution. He was, as Angelika Balabanova put it, an uncompromising compromise. He will do anything he would compromise or anything, as long as that did not really prevent him from accomplishing the one thing on which he wouldn't compromise, and that was the revolution and the establishment of what he thought was going to be a socialist and then a communist state. Now, in the process, Lenin did some pretty despicable things. I think most people knew that. But now we have more documents spelled out. That which is suspected is now spelled out. Well, in some areas, in other words, we do have a significant. In some areas, we really do have simply a little more information. And by and large, I really marvel about how well we did, given the fact that it was a closed society and a lot of articles were accessible, in reading the system. In many areas, we did not understand it. That's the reason, I guess, we were all very surprised when it came apart in 1989. I mean, the system, the whole block. I mean, I always like to tell the story that in 1989, I was in Poland with a group of Fulbrights. We were about 40 of us. We had 2 seminars every day for 40 days. And there were scholars from Eastern Europe, some from Russia, many from Poland, some Germans, and several Americans. June and July, not July and August of 1989. Do you know that in all those discussions, there was not even a single reference to the fact that really this thing may come apart. We came home. In other words, we all overestimated the cohesion. We spoke a little bit about cracks in the bloc, but by and large we thought that it would not fall without a major fight by the Soviet Union, for example, you see, without a major stand. So in many respects, really, all of us, we were convinced that this system, with all its faults, has been there since 1917. It learned how to behave. It became a little fat, maybe. But we kind of thought it was legitimate. And for all practical purposes, the idea that it was going to go, even though we called it a little bit evil every now and then, but I mean, the idea that it was going to really fall without much of a cry, and in the process, and I think this is something I'm going to insist, I think I think the winds of change came from the East this time, with regard to the Soviet bloc. So I'm answering your question in many respects. Really, I sometimes was very much embarrassed, because now we all find ways by which we try to understand why we did not read the situation right. But many of us, we did not. I remember Mr. Smith was here, the fellow who wrote The New Russians, and I interviewed him on radio here, and I said to him, can you explain to me why? He tried to explain that to me by saying, we really did not have enough access into the thinking of the elite, he said, in the party officials and what have you. Maybe. But anyway, in some areas we learned some things, in some areas we reinforced what we knew, and in some areas I think we are pretty much becoming accepting of the fact that we carried a lot of baggage on our shoulders because of the international situation, because of the Cold War. And so, objective as you try to be, somehow it was a fairly major spectrum that you cannot ignore it, you see. After all, the world was in an ideological confrontation as well as political confrontation. Reading and interpreting it right. Sometimes we did it correctly, sometimes we did not. But by and large, we didn't do that. I think we did partly when we overestimated, however, the capacity of the Soviet Union more than once. Whether that was real or not, that's another subject to be discussed later. Anyway, I want to thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you for coming out tonight.
Elizabeth, I wish you would help me use this as a foundation to get David Glantz to come out as a speaker sometime in the future through your contacts. Let's work on that. The other thing that I wanted to mention, if any of you looked on the Minnesota Historical Society webpage, I made an attempt to publish our first 4 programs for this next year. And if you look on that, you'll see that Colonel Don Bussey, remember, who was one of the last surviving ultra officer spoke at the Dr. Deutsch lecture series some years back. He called me and asked to speak on the Cold War this year, next year's program year. I put that on the webpage through Steve Osmond about 2 weeks ago. I was notified last Wednesday, if you looked in the Minneapolis paper, his obituary was published. He was actually buried today at Arlington Cemetery with full military honors. So I will have to make that change of program. But I know that Don Bussey was a friend of yours, a friend of Harold's, and his loss is a great loss to all of us. Thank you very much for coming. Hope to see you in March.
Support for this program provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.